Thank you, Lasky and Corla, and I just like welcome the opportunity to speak on the taxi regulation bill. As has been said, this bill repeals the 2003 Act and replaces it. And there's a number of provisions included in this legislation for exclusions in terms of certain convictions for people from getting PSV licences, the introduction of a demerit or penalty point system, the transferring of the licensing authority to the NTMA away from the Gardaí Carriage Office, and then provisions for service agreements for the enforcement of the regulations. Before I just talk about some of these provisions within the legislation, I would like to just mention, and in relation to a recent proposal, I think, from the Minister in relation to the proposed Rural Hackney Service. I understand from limited media reports that I've seen that it's to be introduced by December, and that there's going to be it's going to be administered through the rural transport companies. And I've seen that there may be restrictions on the areas that the Hackneys can operate on that. But I searched today for some time on the department website and on the NTA website, and I could find no details of it at all. I couldn't even find an announcement in relation to it. And I think it's something that is. Yeah, there's about a two-line paragraph in the review in relation to it, and maybe that's where this has all come from. But you know, I would have a serious concern about it, because I know in rural Donegal, where I come from, there is a lot of Hackney drivers operating there, and there's a lot of, particularly in the town like Killybegs, it's only a population of 12 or 1300. There's about 8 or 9 Hackneys operating there every weekend, and I think that I can see the merit and I can see the thought behind maybe introducing this system through the rural transport, but I think it should be done on the basis of maybe where the existing Hackney licence holders would apply or tender for the proposals through it would be administered then through the transport companies. Because I think what we're actually doing is introducing a third layer of taxis. We have the taxi plate holders, we have the Hackneys, and now we're going to have these new rural Hackneys. And there's going to be a huge problem over the policing of it and the regulation of it, because there's absolutely no doubt that people who would get this rural Hackney service, and they might be restricted to a small village in Donegal that they would operate around within a 5-mile radius, but there's nothing going to stop them coming and operating in the next nearest town and working with it, just because there will be no regulation, because we know that, because I think there's only 9 enforcement officers, 13 now, is it? 19. Oh, that's a big improvement, but for a country this size, there's absolutely no way that you're going to be able to regulate and enforce that industry, and that's just the reality of the situation, Minister. And I think if you are looking at it, I think you should look at maybe the existing Hackney licence holders being able to tender for these proposals with the rural transport companies, and the payments can be arranged with the rural transport companies then. Because I think that's the only way they can operate, because I know for a fact that the Hackney licence holders are struggling and barely making a living as things stand in rural areas at the moment. And I think the difficulty in the making a living, I think, leads into something I know that's not covered in this legislation, and it's in relation to the oversupply of taxis across the country. And I note that the Indicon report estimated, and it was very difficult to make estimations, but somewhere could be up to as high as 22%. Now, I would think, looking around Dublin here at certain times, I would think that that's probably well under the oversupply issue. And it's funny, because we all remember in 2001, 2002, with all the constant complaints about difficulties getting taxis in Dublin and the lack of taxis in Dublin, and then we had deregulation, and it seems to have exploded with deregulation. And it's actually an example of market failure to the other extent, where the market oversupplied and has failed and hasn't been able to rectify itself from that point of view. So it probably would be an interesting study for some economist or something like that there to try and figure out how you can get market failure back the other way, because we're always talking about market failure being a lack of supply and that, but now we're in a situation where we have a complete oversupply, and I think that should be looked at. And I know it's not in the bill, but I think it's something that it does need to be addressed. And I know now as well, you have the whole country, I think, is effectively a taxi meter area, and you can have taxis from rural areas coming in and operating in Dublin at the weekends and stuff like that, and they're going to chase where the business is, and they're going to come after it and try and get where they can make a living. And I suppose that even highlights even more the difficulties for taxi drivers in making a living as things stand at the moment. And I don't think we can rely on the recession to deal with it, because when the recession's over and things improve again, the oversupply will continue to explode again. So I think that, I don't know how you would actually deal with it, but I think it's probably something that would need to be looked at on a more longer term idea. Just in relation to the provisions in the bill itself, I think I do agree with the exclusion of people from getting SV licences based on the past convictions, because I think that is vitally important. And I can't understand why the provisions in the 2003 Act were never implemented, because it doesn't make any sense. Where potentially you could have a sexual abuser or a rapist plying his trade as a taxi driver, and that just doesn't make any sense. So I take it, Minister, that will be implemented rapidly on the passing of this legislation. But I would have, and I would caution one concern, I suppose, in relation to it, is that I know that the provisions are that an existing taxi driver who loses his licence under this provision can have the option to go to the courts to have the licence reinstated if they can show their good character or whatever over the intervening period since their convictions. But I think you should look at another system. There should be some other system that can be done that wouldn't be as costly as going to the courts to have that right vindicated, particularly in the transition period, I suppose, for maybe where existing taxi drivers lose their licences. There may be a system where maybe a judge or a barrister or something like that there could hold a review and make the decision on that basis, rather than people having to go to the courts to have the right vindicated. I think that would be important. And I would have to say that I do agree with what the Sinn Féin deputies have been, assertions they've been making in relation to the Good Friday Agreement and the former combatants who would be excluded under this Act as well. I think provision should be made for that, and I believe that we probably has an obligation on us as a state to make some provision for that as well. And so I think that should be looked at and should be addressed. In relation... Sorry?
2 minutes remaining.
2 minutes left, okay, very quickly. So just in relation to the licensing and the move to the NTA away from the Gardaí and the carriage office, I think that streamlines the provisions, certainly. But I note in the Bills Digest with this piece of legislation, there's concern expressed in relation to the spent convictions bill, which is going through the Shannon now at the minute, where Section 34 specifically excludes people from providing under Section 34 of the 2003 Act, and I think that should be addressed. I don't know, probably with the timing of things you mightn't be able to address it in this bill, but I think it should be addressed that people who have spent convictions shouldn't have to disclose them in relation to applying for licences under the taxi regulation system. And just in relation to the demerit system or the penalty point system, I think that is important, and I've mentioned already the lack of enforcement officers and across the country to make sure that it takes place, and that is a problem we have across all aspects of Irish society. We're great at making the laws, but we're terrible at enforcing them, and we don't commit to the enforcement. Now, in saying that, I know the bill provides that the NTA can enter into service agreements for the enforcement. I have to say I have my own concerns about that as well. I think the outsourcing of enforcement is a retrograde step, and I think what we should be looking at, and we should have a system where it's financed through the license fees, and that we have our own enforcement officers. I think that's the way we have to go, not outsourcing more enforcement. You know, we get to the stage where we've outsourced the traffic cameras now, and we'll probably be privatising and outsourcing Gardaí at some stage in the future, and I don't think that's the way to go, and that's just a philosophical point of view that I have. But in summing up, I agree with the basic tenets of the bill. I think there's a couple of things, if you would look at them, Minister, in relation to the spent convictions and a different system for the holders who are excluded for previous convictions. I think this bill should be okay. Thank you.
And I now call on Minister of State Deputy Adam Kelly to reply to the debate.
Thank you very much, deputies, for your contribution. And I have to thank all the deputies for their contributions, very comprehensive contributions across a whole range of issues. I just want to reply to a couple of points there from previous deputy before I kick off. The whole of Ireland is a taximeter area, deputy, but you actually have to have a licence to operate in each area. So while you can pick up in Donegal and drop somebody to their destination, you can't end up in Dublin and start operating out of Dublin. In relation to the suggestion you have as regards the courts, a very good suggestion. However, there is an appeal mechanism that has been built in through here, which I think will probably meet the requirements that you're referring to. I'm going to